The letter was still damp when Timothy Townsend pressed it open against his knee, the creek water having wrinkled the paper into soft folds that made the ink bleed at the edges. His horse, a broad-chested roan he called Copper, stood knee-deep in the shallows of Miller's Creek, drinking with long, patient pulls while Timothy sat on the mossy bank and read words that were never meant for him. He had almost missed it entirely. The bottle had snagged against a half-submerged root 20 yards upstream, and he would have ridden past it without a second glance if the afternoon sun had not caught the glass just right, throwing a sharp spike of light into his eyes like a signal fire. He had waded in without thinking much about it, pried the cork loose with his thumbnail, and shaken the tightly rolled paper into his palm. Now he could not stop reading. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, the letters formed by someone who had learned to write with discipline, pressing hard to make each word count. But what the words said made Timothy's chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air rolling down off the Rockies. I do not know if anyone will ever find this. I do not know if it matters anymore whether anyone does. My name is Harriet Boone, and I am writing this from Redemption, Colorado, which is neither a redemption nor a mercy, only a town built on broken promises and controlled by a man who has made it impossible for me to leave or to speak the truth to anyone within 50 miles of here. I placed this letter in a bottle because it is the only way I can think to send words beyond his reach. The creek flows north. I hope it flows far enough. Timothy read the line again, controlled by a man. He looked up at the mountains. The peaks were still white-capped, even this late into May of 1879, and the sky above them was the kind of deep, merciless blue that only existed at elevation. He had been up in these mountains for the better part of 2 years, trapping and trading, living the way he liked to live, which was quietly and without obligation to anyone. He was 31 years old. He had no enemies he knew of and no real attachments he could name. He was, by most measures of the time, free. He looked back at the letter. She had written more. Several paragraphs more, in fact, and he read each one with the same tight focus he gave to tracking difficult terrain, not rushing, not skipping, paying attention to every detail because details were what told you the truth of a situation. Harriet Boone had come to Redemption from Abilene, Kansas, 14 months ago. She had answered an advertisement placed in the Abilene Chronicle by a man named Gerald Cass, who had described himself as a widowed cattle rancher, seeking a capable and educated woman to serve as both housekeeper and eventual wife on his Colorado property. The advertisement had been specific about the education requirement, which had appealed to Harriet, who had spent 4 years teaching in a one-room schoolhouse outside Abilene before a severe prairie fire destroyed the building and scattered her students to neighboring counties. She had nothing to keep her in Kansas, she wrote, and Cass had seemed respectable enough in his letters. He was not respectable. Gerald Cass owned Redemption the way a man owns a fist, completely and without apology. He had the sheriff in his pocket, a man named Rudd who wore his badge the way a dog wears a collar, grateful for the leash. He owned the general store, the saloon, the livery, and the single boarding house. He controlled the water rights that the 3 surrounding farms depended on, and when farmers disagreed with him, the creek that fed their irrigation ditches dried up in ways that could not quite be proven deliberate. He had not been violent with Harriet directly, not yet, but the threat was always present in the room with them, the way smoke is present even when there is no open flame. She had not married him. That was the detail Timothy read 3 times to be certain he understood it correctly. She had come out in good faith, intending to honor the arrangement and make a respectable life for herself, and Cass had told her on the first day that there would be no immediate marriage, that she would keep house and prove herself worthy of the honor first. And then a month had passed, and another, and Cass had begun to hint that she would not be leaving regardless of whether any wedding took place. Her return ticket on the Denver and Rio Grande had been purchased with money she no longer had access to, having handed her travel funds to Cass for safekeeping at his insistence on the second day. The final paragraph made Timothy get very slowly to his feet. I do not ask for rescue in the way of a foolish girl in a story. I am not a foolish girl. I ask only that whoever finds this knows that Harriet Boone is in Redemption, Colorado, and that she is there against her will, and that if something happens to her, it was not an accident. The return address is Boone H. General Delivery, Abilene, Kansas, though I am obviously not there. If you send a letter to that address, my sister Clara will receive it. She will know what to do. If you are a decent person, please try to help. If you are not a decent person, please at least be honest enough to throw this back in the creek. Timothy stood on the bank for a long moment with the letter in his hand and the mountains at his back and the sound of copper drinking steadily in the shallows. He looked north, in the direction the water had come from. Redemption was north. He had passed through it once, about a year ago, on his way back from selling furs in Denver. He remembered a wide, dusty main street and a general store with a warped porch and a man standing in front of it who had watched Timothy ride through with the particular stillness of someone counting what they saw. That had been Gerald Cass, he realized now. He had not known it at the time. He folded the letter carefully along its original creases and tucked it into the breast pocket of his coat, close to his chest. He did not make the decision out loud or with any dramatic announcement to the pine trees and the clear, cold air. He simply gathered Copper's reins, swung up into the saddle, and turned north. He rode toward the return address, not toward Abilene, where Harriet Boone was not. Toward Redemption, Colorado, where she was. Because the return address on that letter was not just a mailing direction. It was a declaration of where she had come from and what she deserved to return to. And Timothy Townsend, who had no enemies he knew of and no real attachments he could name, found himself with a sudden and irrevocable sense of purpose that settled over him like snow settling over rock, quietly, completely, and with the kind of weight that does not melt quickly. He had read her words. He intended to find her. Redemption was 4 hours north at an easy pace. Timothy did not push Copper hard on the mountain trails, knowing that haste on switchback terrain cost more than it saved. But he kept a steady rhythm through the afternoon and did not stop except once to water the horse at a stream crossing and check the letter again, as if he needed to confirm that he had read it correctly and had not imagined the whole thing. He had not imagined it. The light was turning amber, and long by the time the trail dropped down out of the pines and leveled into the wider valley where Redemption sat. It was a small town, as he remembered, perhaps 200 residents at most, the kind of settlement that existed because of geography rather than ambition, a town in the fold between mountains that the railroad had decided to service primarily because it was cheaper than going around. There was a water tower and a church steeple and the long flat shape of the stockyards at the southern edge, and as Timothy rode in from the east along the main road, he passed a hand-painted sign that said Redemption, COLO. And beneath it in smaller letters, FOUNDED 1871 GCASS Prop. GCAS Proprietor, not the town council, not the founding families. One man's name on the founding sign, which told Timothy everything he needed to know about how Redemption understood itself. He rode easy, not hurrying, keeping his expression the way he kept his cabin in winter, stripped of anything unnecessary, functional, giving nothing away. He had a broad, sun-darkened face with a jaw that had not seen a razor in 2 weeks, and he wore a heavy canvas coat over his flannel shirt even in May, because above 6,000 feet, May could still kill you at night. He was not a small man. The mountains had a way of making men either small or larger than they might otherwise have been, and Timothy had gone the second direction, not through intention but through the simple daily work of surviving at altitude. He pulled up at the livery first, which was the correct thing to do when you arrived in a town with a horse and a sense of purpose. An older Mexican man with a gray-streaked mustache came out to take Copper, and Timothy paid him 2 nights in advance without being asked, which made the man's eyes settle on him with a slightly different quality of attention. "Good feed," Timothy said. He earned it today. I will see to him, the man said, and Timothy believed him. He took his saddlebags and his rifle and walked to the boarding house, which was the two-story building at the north end of the main street with a painted sign reading CASS House, ROOMS by night OR week. The name on the sign was not a coincidence, which Timothy had already known from the letter. He checked in with a thin-wristed woman at the front desk who noted his name in the ledger without comment and gave him a key to a room on the second floor. "Supper is at 6, she said. "Mr. Cass likes to eat with his boarders when he's in town." Timothy kept his face still. "Is he in town?" "He is," she said, and looked at Timothy with something that might have been a warning if it had been given any more emphasis, but which remained instead in the uncertain territory between caution and information. He nodded and took the key. The room was clean enough and unremarkable: a narrow bed, a washstand, a window that looked out over the back lot of the general store. Timothy set his bags down and stood at the window for a while, watching the back lot. There was a kitchen garden behind the main house next door, laid out in careful rows, the kind of garden that required consistent attention and knowledge. Someone who knew what they were doing had planted it. The beds were edged with flat river stones, and the early-season seedlings were staked with slim wooden rods and twine. It was, Timothy thought, the most orderly and deliberate thing he had seen in the entire town. He thought about the careful, deliberate handwriting in the letter. He thought about a woman who had spent 4 years teaching children and who had come to this valley expecting a reasonable life. He washed his face and hands at the basin and went downstairs to supper. Gerald Cass was a man of about 55 with the particular kind of weathered handsomeness that came from having spent a long time outdoors without ever doing physical work that truly tested him. He was well dressed for a town this size: dark wool coat, clean collar, silver watch chain, and he sat at the head of the dining table with the ease of someone who had sat at the head of every table he had ever occupied. He had thick gray blonde hair and pale eyes that moved around the room the way a man's eyes move when he is counting things. There were 5 boarders at supper, plus Cass, plus the thin-wristed woman whose name Timothy gathered was Mrs. Peel. And there was one other person at the table who had not been in the room when Timothy came downstairs, who had entered quietly from the kitchen carrying a covered dish, and who set it down at the center of the table without looking at anyone in particular. Harriet Boone was perhaps 28 years old, Timothy estimated. She was not tall, but she held herself with the straightness of someone who had decided that posture was one of the things that remained within her own control. Her dark hair was pinned up under what would have been, in better circumstances, a neatly kept style, though several strands had escaped in the heat of the kitchen and framed her face with what was probably unintentional effect. Her eyes, when she finally glanced up at the table to check that the dish was placed correctly, were a dark, watchful brown, and when they crossed Timothy's face they paused for exactly 1/4 of a second longer than they paused on anyone else's, and then moved on. He did not react. He picked up his fork and waited for Cass to begin the meal. "New face," Cass said, looking at Timothy with that counting quality. "Passing through." "Might stay a few days," Timothy said. "Came down from the high country, looking to trade some furs, pick up supplies. There's a trapper settles in around Miller's Creek most of the year," Cass said. "That you?" "Could be." Cass smiled, which was the kind of smile that men use when they want you to understand that they know more than they are saying. "Miller's Creek runs through my land for about 8 miles before it hits the valley. Good fishing up there, I'm told." "It is," Timothy said. "Funny thing about that creek," Cass said, cutting his meat with precise strokes. "Had a hand ride up to check the fence line last week. Said he found a section of the bank disturbed. Like someone had been rooting around in the shallows." Timothy looked at him steadily. "Animals do that. Beaver mostly." "Mostly," Cass agreed, and let the word sit there. Harriet Boone had seated herself at the far end of the table, below the salt, as they used to say, in the position of someone who ate at this table daily but did not do so as a guest. She ate in small, neat movements and kept her attention on her plate. Timothy did not look at her directly again, but he was aware of her the way he was aware of weather, not through sight, but through some combination of sound and air pressure, and the shift of light that told you something significant was present. He was also aware that Gerald Cass was watching him watch the table, and that Cass was a man who had built an entire town around the ability to notice things. After supper, the boarders drifted to the parlor or back to their rooms. Timothy took his time in the parlor, accepting a glass of whiskey from Mrs. Peel because refusing would have seemed strange, and listening to Cass hold court about the coming cattle season and the likelihood of a new rail spur that would change everything for the valley. Timothy listened and asked occasional practical questions, and gave nothing away about himself except the impression of a straightforward man with no particular agenda. Cass left the parlor at 8:30. Timothy waited another 20 minutes, finished his whiskey, and said good night to the remaining boarders. In the hallway, he nearly collided with Harriet Boone coming out of the kitchen with an empty tray, and the collision was not quite accidental on his part, because he had timed his exit from the parlor to coincide with what he estimated would be the end of the kitchen work. And he was, after 4 years in the mountains, a very good estimator. She stepped back sharply. He caught the edge of the tray before it could clatter. "Sorry," he said quietly, "didn't see you." Her eyes came up to his, and this close, in the dim hallway with the single lamp on the side table, he could see that they were not simply dark brown but had something amber in the depths, like creek water over a certain kind of stone, and that they were very tired, and that behind the tiredness was something that was not defeated but was working very hard not to become defeated. "No harm done," she said. Her voice was low and controlled, the voice of a schoolteacher who had learned to project calm even when she did not feel it. He held her gaze for one moment, not long enough to be noticed by anyone who might be watching, but long enough to make it mean something. Then he stepped aside, and she passed him in the hallway, and he went upstairs to his room. He lay on the narrow bed in the dark and stared at the ceiling for a long time. He had confirmed that she was real, that the letter was real, and that the situation described in the letter was real. He had also confirmed that Gerald Cass was exactly the kind of man Harriet Boone had written about, not violently menacing in any way that could be pointed to directly, but constructed entirely of implication and control, the way a cage is made not of what it contains, but of what it prevents from escaping. The question now was what to do about it. Timothy was not a man who made decisions loudly. He turned things over the way he turned stones at a stream crossing, carefully, looking at what was underneath. He was not in a position to simply demand that Harriet be released, because she was not technically imprisoned. She was, in the eyes of the town and possibly in the eyes of the law, a housekeeper who was presumably free to leave at any time. The fact that her money had been taken and her choices had been systematically removed was not the kind of thing Sheriff Rudd was going to trouble himself with. What Timothy needed was time, and a plan, and a way to communicate with Harriet Boone that did not put her in worse danger than she was already in. He fell asleep with the letter still in his breast pocket, and woke before dawn with a clarity of purpose that felt like the air just before sunrise, cold and clean, and full of light that had not yet arrived. The next morning he was down at the kitchen garden before anyone else in the house was awake, on the reasonable pretext of needing fresh air, which was a pretext no one in 1879 Colorado found suspicious. He walked the perimeter of the garden looking at the plantings, and when Harriet came out the back door at just past 6 in the morning with a small basket and a pair of worn leather gloves to do the early watering, she stopped when she saw him, and her expression moved through surprise, wariness, and then a careful neutrality that cost her something to maintain. "Good morning," he said. "This is your work." He gestured at the garden. It was not a question. "It keeps me busy," she said. There was weight on the word busy that had nothing to do with occupation, and everything to do with purpose, with the need to maintain something of her own in a place where everything else had been taken. He crouched down beside one of the nearest beds, looking at the seedlings. "Tomatoes," he said, "brave at this altitude." "They need the wall for warmth," she said, nodding at the south-facing stone wall that ran along the garden's edge. "And early starts. I planted these inside in March." He looked up at her. She was standing perhaps 6 feet away, and she was watching him with an expression he could not entirely read, which was unusual for him. He was generally good at reading people. What he thought he saw was a woman deciding whether or not to trust someone, and doing it with the methodical care of a person who had learned in the hardest possible way what trusting the wrong person cost. He reached into his breast pocket and held up the folded letter. The color left her face so completely and so suddenly that he got to his feet without thinking, in case she needed steadying. But she did not faint or stumble. She stood very still and stared at the letter with an expression that was a composite of shock, relief, terror, and something he could only call recognition. The recognition of a message she had sent into the void being returned to her with proof of receipt. "Miller's Creek," he said. "I found it yesterday afternoon." Her voice, when she found it, was barely above a whisper. "How long ago did I? It was 3 weeks ago." "Creek's running slow this time of year," he said. "The bottle caught on a root." She pressed her gloved hand briefly over her mouth. He could see her breathing carefully, deliberately, the way you breathe when you are trying not to make a sound that would travel into a house where someone might be listening. "You came here," she said. "You read it and you came here." "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment with those amber-dark eyes that were doing a great deal of work. Then she looked at the back door of the house, which was closed, and at the fence line, and at the kitchen garden that she had built from the inside out as a small, portable piece of autonomy. "He will notice," she said. "If we stand here and talk, someone will notice and tell him." "Then talk to me while you water your garden," Timothy said, "and I will crouch here and look at your tomato seedlings, and anyone watching from the house will see a boarder admiring a kitchen garden, which happens to be entirely unremarkable." Something shifted in her expression. Not a smile, not yet, but the suggestion of one, the pre-dawn glow before the actual light arrives. She opened her basket and took out the small watering can she had brought and began moving along the beds with practiced efficiency. And Timothy moved with her, keeping a natural distance, and they talked in the way of two people who have understood simultaneously that they need to understand each other very quickly and very precisely. She told him what had not been in the letter, because the letter had been written with the awareness that it might be found by anyone, and so she had been careful about specifics. She told him that Cass had taken her travel money and her return train ticket on the 3rd day, telling her she would need them for the return journey after the wedding, when of course there was no return journey being planned. She told him that he had confiscated the letter she had tried to write to her sister Clara 3 months in, intercepted at the postal drop in the general store, which he owned. She told him that she had attempted to speak to Sheriff Rudd and had been told, pleasantly and without any particular hostility, that Mr. Cass was a fine man who had done a great deal for the town, and that she should try to be more appreciative of her circumstances. She told him that 2 other women had been brought out to redemption on similar arrangements over the past 7 years, and that both had eventually disappeared from town in circumstances that Cass described to anyone who asked as the women having moved on of their own accord. She had not been able to find out more about them, because asking questions about them made Cass look at her in a way that suggested she was getting close to something she should not be close to. Timothy listened to all of this without interrupting, crouching beside the beds and turning a small flat stone over in his hands, and when she finished, he set the stone down with a deliberate quietness. "How much money would you need to get to Denver?" he asked. "And from there back to Abilene?" She blinked. "I know the train fares, $3.40 from here to Denver on the D and RG. From Denver to Abilene it's more, $7 or $8 depending on the car." He nodded. He had more than that in his saddlebag from the fur trade. That was not the problem. The problem was that getting Harriet Boone out of redemption without Cass knowing in time to stop it required either speed or subtlety, and he did not yet know which was available. "He has people watching," she said, as if she had followed his thought. "Not formally, but there are men in town who tell him things. The livery man, the bartender, possibly Mrs. Peel, though I am less certain of her." "The livery man is Mexican," Timothy said. "Older, gray mustache." She looked at him with slight surprise. "That is Senor Ortega. He has been here for many years. I believe he was here before Cass bought the livery." She paused. "I have always thought he was not entirely comfortable with certain arrangements, but I have no proof of that." Timothy filed that away. "I need a few days," he said. "Not many." "Can you be patient for a few days?" She looked at him for a moment that contained a considerable amount of history. She had been patient for 14 months, and he heard that in the pause before she answered, not with bitterness but with the simple factual weight of someone for whom patience was no longer a novelty. "Yes," she said, "but I need to know one thing." "Ask it." "Why are you doing this?" She was looking at him directly with the full force of those careful, intelligent eyes. "You have no obligation to me. You have no stake in what happens here. You are a trapper who lives alone in the mountains. Why did you not simply throw the bottle back in the creek?" He considered his answer for a moment, because it deserved a real answer and not the easy kind. "Because you asked me not to," he said. "In the last line of the letter, you said, 'If you are a decent person, please try to help. And if you are not, at least be honest enough to throw it back.'" He met her eyes. "I decided I would rather be the first kind." The pre-dawn glow in her expression became something warmer and more real, and she turned back to her watering, and he could see her working to keep her face composed, and he thought that the composure was one of the most beautiful and most heartbreaking things he had ever seen. He spent the rest of that day conducting himself exactly as a trapper in town, for supplies and trade would conduct himself. He visited the general store and bought flour, coffee, salt, and gunpowder, paying with coin and making pleasant small talk with the clerk, a young man named Amos who had the eager helpfulness of someone who reported everything back to his employer. Timothy gave him nothing worth reporting except the impression of a straightforward transaction. He went to the saloon in the early afternoon and played 2 hands of cards and drank 1 beer and listened to the talk of the room, which told him several useful things. That there was a Denver and Rio Grande train that came through Redemption on Monday and Thursday mornings. That Cass was expected to ride out to the eastern pasture on Thursday to assess the cattle that were being brought down from Winter Range. And that there was a general unease in the town about a mining claim in the northern hills that Cass was trying to acquire from a family named Whitmore, who did not want to sell. He also got a sense of which men in the saloon were Cass's men, which was useful, and which ones were simply working men who tolerated Cass's control of the town the way you tolerate cold weather, not because you approve of it, but because the alternatives are more expensive than the inconvenience. On his way back to the boarding house, he walked past the livery and looked in without stopping, and Senor Ortega was there, grooming a bay horse with the careful attention he had given to Copper. He was humming something quietly and did not look up, and Timothy did not stop, but he registered the fact that Ortega was the kind of man who gave care to things whether or not anyone was watching, which was a character indicator he valued highly. That evening, Cass was not at supper. Mrs. Peel served the meal without comment about his absence, and Harriet moved from kitchen to table with her customary quiet efficiency, and Timothy ate and listened and gave nothing away. But when he helped himself to a second portion of bread from the basket on his end of the table, he took the small folded piece of paper that had been tucked under the edge of the basket and closed his hand around it without any change in his expression, and he read it later in his room by lamplight. She had written, "Thursday. I heard him tell Rudd he would be gone until midday. That gives 3 hours before he would know." He thought about this. 3 hours was enough, if the train cooperated, and if he had everything arranged before Thursday morning. He wrote his reply on the back of the same paper in the same small, tight handwriting that a life of practical documentation had given him, and slid it back under the bread basket at breakfast the next morning while reaching for his coffee. His reply said, Thursday. Train is 7:15. Be at the east end of the main street at 7. Bring only what you can carry without it being noticed as packing. I will have 2 horses. He spent Wednesday arranging what he needed. He went to the general store and bought a second set of saddlebags and a bedroll and provisions for a 2-day ride, explaining to Amos the clerk that he had decided to go further into the mountains before heading back to his trapline, as he had heard there was good marten habitat in the northern range. Amos nodded and rang it up, and Timothy paid and left, and he estimated that Amos would relay a version of this to Cass that afternoon, which was actually useful. It established a plausible reason for Timothy to be making preparations that involved riding gear and supplies. On Wednesday evening he went to the livery just before closing, ostensibly to check on Copper, and found Senor Ortega alone, cleaning a saddle by the last light through the wide doors. Timothy came directly to the point, because he had assessed Ortega as a man who would not appreciate anything else. I am going to need a second horse on Thursday morning, he said. A good one that can make a sustained pace for several hours. I am willing to pay well above the rental rate. Ortega continued cleaning the saddle for a moment without looking up. Where are you going? He said in his unhurried way. East first, Timothy said. Then south to the rail junction at Cedar Fork where I can pick up the D and RG line. Ortega set down the cleaning cloth. He looked at Timothy with eyes that had been watching the situation in Redemption for a long time, and in which Timothy could see a long and complicated accounting. Miss Harriet, Ortega said. It was not a question. Yes, Timothy said. Ortega was quiet for a moment. He looked down at the saddle, and then back up at Timothy, and there was in his expression the particular dignity of a man who has watched something wrong happen over a long period of time while being unable to stop it, and who has had to calculate every day whether the cost of resistance outweighed the cost of complicity, and who has not been entirely comfortable with either side of the calculation. I have a good mare, he said. Steady, deep in the chest. She will go all day if you need her. He paused. There is no rental fee. Timothy looked at him. There will be a fee, he said firmly. A fair one. You have a living to make and a livery to keep. And I need you to be able to say honestly, if Cass asks you, that I paid you the full rate for 2 animals and gave no indication of where I was actually going. Ortega considered this for a moment and then nodded slowly, and something in his bearing suggested that he had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone to arrive who would take this problem seriously. Be here at 6:45, he said. Thursday morning was cold and still, the way mountain mornings in May are before the sun clears the eastern ridge, and the main street of Redemption was empty except for a dog sleeping in the dust outside the saloon, and a rooster making its preliminary announcement from somewhere behind the church. Timothy was dressed and carrying his saddlebags before 5:30, having slept in his clothes and lain awake in the dark through the last hour of night, going through the plan the way a careful man goes through a plan, looking for the places where it could break. The most obvious vulnerability was time. If Cass for any reason did not ride out to the eastern pasture as reported, or if he rode out and returned early, the entire construct collapsed. Timothy had no way to know, before 7 in the morning, whether Thursday would proceed as expected. He could only move forward on the information he had and be prepared to improvise. He paid Mrs. Peel his room bill at just past 6, telling her that he had decided to head back earlier than expected, and she took his money with the same thin-wristed efficiency she brought to everything and did not ask any questions. And Timothy thought that whatever Mrs. Peel knew and did not say was probably its own significant weight for her to carry. He collected Copper and the mare, whose name was apparently Rosa, from Ortega at 6:45. He paid Ortega fairly and honestly. Ortega shook his hand with a dry, firm grip and said nothing else, and Timothy respected him enormously for it. At 7, he was at the east end of the main street, holding both horses, and the town was still mostly quiet, and the sky was beginning its slow lightening over the eastern ridge, and he was aware that the next minutes would determine a great deal. She came at 1 minute past 7. He saw her from 30 yards, coming along the side of the dry goods building, and she was carrying a canvas bag over one shoulder and had her dark hair pinned under a plain bonnet, and she was walking at the precise pace of someone who is moving as quickly as they dare without running, which is a very specific gait that requires considerable self-control. When she reached him, she was slightly breathless and her eyes were wide and bright, and she looked at the two horses and then at Timothy with an expression that contained a question she did not have the breath to voice. "He rode out," he said, "about 40 minutes ago. I saw him from the window." She closed her eyes briefly. Not more than 2 seconds, but he saw the depth of her relief in those 2 seconds, the way you see the whole depth of a well in the moment the light hits it at the right angle. "The train is at 7:15, she said, because she had not forgotten. "We are not taking the train from here," he said. "Cass owns the station agent. The moment you buy a ticket to Denver, he will send a wire." He helped her up onto Rosa, who accepted the rider calmly and without comment, as a good trail horse does. "We ride to Cedar Fork. It is 13 miles south and east, the 10:40 from there to Denver. We will be in Denver before he is back from the pasture." She settled into the saddle with the confidence of someone who had ridden before, adjusted the stirrups herself, and nodded once with the decisive quality of a woman who had made her decision and was not going to reconsider it. They rode out of Redemption at a walk, because 2 riders walking out of town at 7 in the morning was unremarkable. The town did not stir. The dog outside the saloon opened one eye and closed it again. The rooster continued its declaration from behind the church. They did not speak for the first mile, until the last of Redemption's buildings had passed out of sight behind the curve of the valley, and the trail entered the open scrubland where the juniper grew low and gray-green against the reddish dirt. Then Timothy let out a long, slow breath that he had been holding since 6:45, and Harriet made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was in the same general category, a small, involuntary release of tension that had been contained under very high pressure for a very long time. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am," she said. She looked around at the open sky, at the mountains still white above the ridge line, at the empty trail ahead of them. "I am far more all right than I have been in 14 months. He nodded, and they pushed the horses into a trot, and the miles began to fall behind them. The trail to Cedar Fork crossed 2 creek beds and went through a stretch of open meadow that was fully visible from the high ground to the north, which was the direction of Redemption, and the direction from which Cass would come if he came at all. Timothy rode with one eye on that ridge for the better part of 5 miles, until the trail dipped into the tree cover of the lower canyon, and the ridge was no longer visible above them. In the canyon, they slowed to a walk again to let the horses breathe, and Harriet rode beside him on the narrow trail with her chin up and her eyes moving, taking in the landscape with an attention that seemed, after months of being confined to the circumference of Redemption, almost hungry. "You never told me your name," she said. "Timothy Townsend." She looked at him with a slight tilt of her head. "You found my letter and rode to a town you had no business in and arranged a departure that required considerable planning for the benefit of a woman you had never met." "I had met you by then," he said, "at supper, and in the garden, briefly. Briefly is sometimes enough to form an accurate impression." She was quiet for a moment, and then, "What was your impression?" He considered this question the way he considered most important things, honestly and without ornament. "That you were intelligent," he said, "and that you were frightened in the way of someone who is not accustomed to being frightened and has not accepted it as permanent. And that you planted a kitchen garden in an intolerable situation because it was the most assertive act available to you, and you were not willing to stop being assertive." She was quiet for long enough that he wondered if he had said something wrong. "That is a very accurate impression," she said at last, in a voice that was somewhat carefully controlled. They did not speak much for the rest of the canyon section, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who have said something real to each other and are letting it settle, the way you let a new fire settle before you add the larger logs. Cedar Fork was a way station more than a real town, a station building, a water tower, a platform, a small hotel that was actually just a house with extra bedrooms, and a general store that was also the telegraph office. The 1040 from Denver to Alamosa stopped here going east, and the same line ran a train going west through Pueblo and into Denver at 1040 going the other direction. Timothy had checked the schedule carefully against his memory of the redemption conversations. They arrived with an hour to spare. He tied the horses at the station rail and told Harriet to wait inside the station building while he bought the tickets. He bought two, one-way Denver second class, which was perfectly comfortable and not conspicuous. He also, in the same transaction, sent a brief telegram to the Abilene, Kansas General Post Office addressed to Clara Boone, which read, "Your sister is safe. Traveling to Denver today. Please reply to T. Townsend, C.O. Mountain House Hotel, Denver." He had not told Harriet he was going to do this, and when he came back to the station building and handed her the telegram receipt, her face did something complicated and private, and she pressed the paper against her chest for a moment in a gesture that was wholly unguarded and that Timothy looked carefully away from, because it was not something meant for an audience. "Thank you," she said when she had collected herself. "Your sister has been worried," he said simply. "She has," Harriet agreed. "For a very long time." The train came on time, which trains did not always do, but which this one was decent enough to manage on this particular Thursday, and they boarded and found their seats, and the conductor punched their tickets without remark. And when the train pulled away from Cedar Fork and the Colorado landscape began to move past the windows in the long, rolling way that train travel shows you the land, Timothy watched Harriet Boone's face as she watched out the window. He was not doing it obviously. He was doing it the way he watched everything important with peripheral awareness, giving most of his apparent attention to something else. But he watched her, and he saw the exact moment when the distance from redemption became large enough to feel real, and in that moment her expression changed in a way that was almost physical, as if she were setting down something she had been carrying for a very long time. She turned and caught him watching her, and he did not pretend he had not been. "I wrote that letter on a night in April," she said. "There was a thunderstorm and Cass had gone to the saloon, and Mrs. Peel was asleep early. I sat in the kitchen and wrote it by the lamp, and then I rolled it up and pushed it into the bottle I had been saving for 3 weeks, and I went down to the creek in the dark and waded out to where the current ran strongest in the middle and let it go." She looked at her hands in her lap. "I did not honestly believe it would reach anyone who could do anything. I wrote it because I could not bear to write nothing." Timothy thought about the bottle catching on the root, 20 yards from where he had been watering his horse on a May afternoon. He thought about how easily he might have ridden past it if the sun had been at a different angle. "The current pushed it into a root," he said. "It could have sat there for weeks more, or all summer." "But it did not," she said. "But it did not," he agreed. The train rocked steadily along its rails, and outside the window the front range came closer in that gradual, magnificent way it had, the mountains growing larger as you approached them from the plains until they filled the entire western sky like a wall of pure altitude. Denver in May of 1879 was a city in the middle of becoming larger than it remembered being. The silver strikes in Leadville the year before had sent money cascading through Colorado like a second river, and Denver had caught most of it and was spending it on brick buildings and new hotels, and the general architectural confidence of a city that believed it would still be there in 50 years. The Mountain House Hotel that Timothy had chosen was a respectable establishment on Larimer Street, not grand, but clean and well-run, with the important quality of being staffed by people who were not in the habit of reporting on their guests to anyone. He got 2 rooms, adjacent but not connected, paying for 3 days each. Harriet stood in the lobby while he registered, and he could see her taking in the space with the careful assessment of a woman who has had to calibrate every environment she entered for potential danger, and was finding, with some adjustment, that this particular environment was simply a hotel lobby, neutral and commercial and requiring nothing of her. "When did you last sleep easily?" he asked her, when they were in the hallway outside their rooms. She considered this with a seriousness he recognized as genuine. "October," she said. "Before things became worse, I used to sleep tolerably in the summer." "Then sleep," he said. "We have 3 days to make arrangements, and there is nothing that needs doing in the next few hours. I have sent the wire to your sister. There will be a reply by morning." She looked at him with an expression that was trying to locate the appropriate distance between gratitude and something else that did not yet have a clear name. "You are a very practical man," she said. "I have had to be," he said. "The mountains are not forgiving of impracticality." She almost smiled at that more than the almost she had managed in the kitchen garden, something that reached her eyes for a brief, genuine moment before she collected it back. "Good night, Mr. Townsend," she said. "Good night, Miss Boone," he said, and meant it with a sincerity that surprised him mildly. He lay awake for a while, not with anxiety but with the particular attentiveness that followed high-stakes action, the mind continuing to run the calculations even after the immediate need had passed. He thought about Cass returning to Redemption and finding the housekeeper gone. He thought about what Cass would do next, and how much of a threat he represented from this distance. He thought about the fact that Denver was a city, and that cities had, among other protections, anonymity, and that Cass's reach in Denver was likely limited to whatever he could accomplish by telegraph, which required knowing where Timothy and Harriet were, which he did not. He also thought about what came next for Harriet Boone after the immediate danger was resolved, and he found that this question held his attention more than the practical ones, which was worth noting. The reply from Clara Boone arrived at the Mountain House Hotel front desk before 8 the next morning, and Timothy brought it to Harriet's door and knocked. She answered promptly, already dressed, and when she saw the telegram she opened it with fingers that were not entirely steady and read it and then read it again. He waited without speaking. "She is in Abilene," Harriet said. "She has been there all this time, waiting." She looked up. "She says she has been writing letters to me every month. He never gave me a single one." The flatness in her voice when she said that last sentence was not emptiness but its opposite. It was the sound of anger that had been compressed into a small, dense form, the way coal is compressed into something that burns longer and hotter than the wood it came from. "I am sorry," Timothy said. "That is a cruelty." "It is." She folded the telegram precisely. "She wants me to come home. She has a room. She is married now to a man named Samuel Hatch, and they have a house with room enough." She paused. "She says to come as soon as I can, and she will meet the train." "The train east from Denver leaves tomorrow evening at 5, Timothy said. "I checked the schedule this morning." She looked at him with those eyes that he was finding, the more he looked at them, contained an unusual quality of directness, not confrontational, but honest in the way that he himself tended to be honest, which was without apology or performance. "You have been very thorough," she said. "I did not want you to be uncertain about your options," he said. She tilted her head very slightly. "Mr. Townsend, what are you going to do after I leave?" The question was direct, and it landed with a weight that surprised him, which meant he had not been entirely honest with himself about certain things. "Go back to the mountains, I expect," he said. "My trapline needs attention." She nodded, studying him. "Alone," she said. "Not a judgment, just a clarification." "That has been the general arrangement," he said. She was quiet for a moment, and then, "Would you have breakfast with me this morning? I would like to talk, if you are willing." They had breakfast at a small restaurant on 15th Street, where the coffee was good, and the morning light came through the large front windows in a way that was warm and unhurried. and they talked for the better part of 2 hours in the way that two people talk when they are trying to understand each other beyond the emergency that brought them together. She told him about growing up in Abilene with Clara, the daughters of a blacksmith who had come west in 1858 and built something practical and lasting. She told him about the schoolhouse and the children she had taught, and the way she had felt about teaching, not as labor but as something that organized the world into meaningful patterns, which was, she said, what she most needed from any work she did. She told him about the prairie fire that had ended it, the orange wall of flame visible for 30 miles in every direction, the acrid smell that stayed in the back of your throat for weeks. She told him about the loneliness of Abilene afterward, with the school gone and her sister newly married and her father aging toward the kind of fragility he would never admit to, and how the advertisement in the paper had seemed, in a moment of genuine vulnerability, like a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation. I was not reckless, she said, with a precision that told him she had thought about this many times. I was thorough. I wrote to Cass several times before I agreed. I spoke to the postmaster in Abilene who knew of him. I was not careless. No, Timothy said. He was careful to seem trustworthy. That is a different thing from you being incautious. She looked at him with a quality of gratitude that was not about relief, but about being seen correctly, which was perhaps a rarer thing. He told her about himself in return, because the exchange felt honest and he wanted to be honest. He had grown up in Ohio, the third son of a farmer who had had more sons than land and had made it clear, without unkindness, that the younger ones would need to find their own places in the world. Timothy had gone west at 22, intending the usual kind of adventure that young men of that era intended when they went west, and had instead found something quieter and more sustaining: the mountains, the trapline, the long solitary winters with the pine silence and the clear creek water and the kind of self-sufficiency that felt at its best like integrity. "You are not lonely?" she asked. "I have been," he said. "Less so recently." He did not elaborate on this, but he said it plainly enough that the meaning was available to her if she chose to take it. She looked at him for a moment with a quality of attention that was both tentative and entirely focused, and then she looked at her coffee cup, and he could see her thinking, which was a visible process with her in a way he found he very much liked. "I do not know what I think about you yet," she said, with the directness he was coming to expect from her. "I know that you are good. I know that with some clarity. But I have been in a situation recently where I placed faith in a representation of goodness and was wrong, and it has made me careful." "That is sensible," he said. "I have no objection to you being careful. You are not offended by someone taking care with their trust." He looked at her steadily. "No, I think it is one of the more admirable things a person can do." She looked at him for a long moment. "You are a very unusual man, Mr. Townsend." "I have had unusual circumstances," he said. "They have a way of making a man unusual if he pays attention." They spent the rest of the first day in Denver doing the practical things that needed doing, because practical things were anchoring, and Harriet had spent 14 months in a situation where she had no control over practical things, and the ability to choose her own boots at the Denver dry goods store and pay for them with money Timothy had given her as a loan against the future was, he could see, something that mattered on a level beyond the footwear. He gave her the money matter-of-factly, framing it as a practicality and making no ceremony of it, and she accepted it in the same spirit, with a promise to repay that she said with the firmness of someone who keeps that kind of promise. She bought practical things: a new pair of sturdy boots, a warm coat for the train, a writing set with paper and good ink, and a slim volume of poetry from a bookseller's cart that she picked up and turned over with a brief, private pleasure that he thought she did not realize he saw. On the second day in Denver, things shifted. It was raining, a spring rain that came in off the mountains and turned the unpaved side streets to mud and kept sensible people indoors. And Timothy and Harriet had spent the morning writing letters, she to Clara, a long one, and he to his trading contact in Taos, a purely business communication about the spring fur prices. They were seated in the small reading parlor of the hotel, on opposite sides of a table with adequate lamplight, and they had been writing in companionable silence for over an hour. He finished his letter and looked up, and she was reading what she had written, reviewing it with a slightly furrowed brow that suggested she was not entirely satisfied with something. And the rain was making its sound against the window, and the lamp was warm on the table between them, and Timothy Townsend, who was a practical and generally unsentimental man, was struck with a force he had not anticipated by the simple domestic reality of sitting across a table from a woman who was smart and brave and honest, and who had been through something terrible, and was rebuilding herself with the same methodical care she brought to a kitchen garden. He looked back down at his own paper. He was quiet for a moment. "Miss Boone," he said. She looked up. He had not entirely decided what he was going to say before he said it, which was unusual for him, but he proceeded on the trust that honesty, even imprecise honesty, was better than silence in this case. "I am aware that you are leaving tomorrow," he said, "and that you have a sister in Abilene and a life to rebuild and a great many things that are far more pressing than the conversation I am about to attempt to have." He paused. "And I am aware that 3 days is a very short acquaintance, and that you have every reason to be cautious about the opinions of men you have known for only 3 days." She had set down her pen and was watching him with an expression that was, he thought, almost amused in a way that was also somewhat tender, which was a combination he had not encountered before. "Nevertheless," he said. "Nevertheless," she agreed with a slight inclination of her head that said, "Please continue." "I would like to write to you," he said, "if you would be willing to receive letters, and if you would be willing to write in return at your own judgment and on your own terms. I am not asking for any conclusion or any commitment of any kind. I am asking if you would be willing to correspond and to consider whether in the course of that correspondence you might find me worth knowing better." She looked at him for a moment that was long enough to do several things: to assess him, to assess herself, to assess the question, and to arrive at an answer. "I write very honestly," she said. "In letters, I do not know how to be otherwise when I write." "I have read your letters," he said. "I am counting on it." She picked up her pen again, and he saw the suggestion of the pre-dawn glow again, the warmth that preceded the full light. "Yes," she said, "I will write to you, Timothy." She had used his given name for the first time, and he did not think it was unconscious. "Thank you, Harriet," he said, and used hers in return. He put her on the eastbound train the next evening at the Denver Union Depot, which was a grand station for a frontier city, all high ceilings and the smell of coal smoke and the particular atmosphere of departure and arrival that makes train stations feel charged with significance. She had her canvas bag and her new coat and her writing set, and the slim book of poetry tucked into the outer pocket of the bag where she could reach it easily. She turned to him on the platform with the train behind her, already breathing its impatient steam. "I will write when I arrive," she said, "so you know I arrived safely." "I would appreciate that," he said. She looked at him for a moment with the full amber-dark attention of her gaze, and then she did something that he had not expected and that he would think about for a long time after. She reached out and took his hand briefly and firmly, the way you take a handshake, but warmer and with a different quality of intention. "Thank you," she said, "for being the first kind of person." He closed his hand around hers for the moment she allowed it. "Take care of yourself," he said, "and write to me." She smiled at him, the full smile finally, the one that reached every part of her face, and that was, he thought, spectacular in its genuineness. Then she turned and stepped up into the train car, and he stood on the platform and watched the train pull out and kept standing there until it was entirely gone. He spent another week in Denver dealing with the fur trade business he had used as his cover story in Redemption, which turned out to be quite real and quite profitable. And then he rode back into the mountains, back to the cabin on Miller's Creek with its simple furnishings, and its wood pile and its view of the long white peaks to the west. He had told the tradesman in Denver to hold any letters for him until the next trip down. But 3 weeks later, coming down for supplies, there was a letter at the Mountain House Hotel from Abilene, Kansas, and he sat in the hotel dining room and read it over coffee. She wrote exactly as she had promised, honestly and without performance. She told him about the homecoming, about Clara's tears at the station and the solid, quiet handshake from Samuel Hatch, who seemed to be a reliable man, and about the small room in their house that was hers and that looked out over the backyard and was, she wrote, more hers in every meaningful sense than anything she had occupied in the last 14 months. She wrote about resuming her correspondence with the county school board, which had expressed interest in her returning to teaching when the new school building in the Eastern District was completed, expected in September. She wrote about Abilene in the spring, which she had not seen in over a year, and which looked to her eyes now with a sharpness and a gratitude it had not had before, the way things look when you have been afraid of not seeing them again. At the end, she wrote, I find myself in the evening sitting with Clara and thinking about the mountains. I had not thought particularly about the mountains before. I find that now I think about them quite regularly. I suspect this is related to certain recent associations. He read that last part twice, and then folded the letter with care and put it in his breast pocket, in the same place he had carried the bottle letter, and went back up into the mountains and wrote her a long reply that same evening by firelight. The correspondence continued through the spring and summer of 1879, letters moving in both directions between the Rocky Mountains of Colorado and the flat plains of Kansas. And they were letters in the fullest sense of the word, not casual notes but real writing, considered and detailed, the kind of letters that two intelligent and honest people write to each other when they are attempting to know each other from a distance and taking the project seriously. He wrote to her about the mountains in a way he had never described them to anyone, not because he was unobservant but because there had never been anyone who wanted the description. He wrote about the marten and the beaver and the particular quality of silence at high altitude before a snowstorm, which was different from all other silences. He wrote about the way the light came across the creek in late July, amber and slow, catching the water in ways that made it look as though the creek itself were generating warmth. He wrote once about finding her bottle in the water and what it had felt like to stand on that bank and read her words. She wrote back about teaching, about the new school building going up in the Eastern District and her meetings with the school board, who were, she reported, pleasingly serious about education for the whole of the district, and not merely the children of established families. She wrote about her sister Clara's news, which turned out to include a pregnancy, Clara being in the early months of it and cautiously hopeful. She wrote about Abilene and about the sky over the Kansas plains, which she described with a beauty he had not expected from a landscape he had always found flatter than he preferred, and which made him want to see it through her eyes. She also wrote about Cass. Not often, and not at length, but once in a letter in late July, she told him that word had reached Abilene through a contact of Clara's husband Samuel, who had business connections in Colorado, that Gerald Cass had sent a man to look for her as far as Pueblo, but had not pursued the matter further. She speculated, with a measured composure that he respected, that Cass had calculated the cost and risk of a wider search, and found it exceeded the value of recovering one housekeeper, particularly one who, if she chose to speak publicly about her experiences, could cause him problems he would prefer to avoid. He had apparently found another arrangement for his household, and the situation in redemption had proceeded as before. She wrote, I believe he will not come for me, but I hold that belief carefully with both hands, the way you hold something you are not certain of. He wrote back, I believe you are right, but tell me immediately if anything changes. I am not difficult to reach, and I am not slow when the situation requires speed. She had replied to that letter with a paragraph that he had read perhaps 8 times, not because it was ambiguous, but because it said something with such directness and care that it warranted repeated attention. She wrote, "Timothy, I have been thinking about something since April that I want to say directly, because I am better at directness than implication. I know 3 days is a very short time, and I know that the circumstances of those 3 days were of an unusual nature that may have created certain feelings that would not survive ordinary conditions. I also know that I am a woman who spent 14 months in a very difficult situation, and that I should probably be careful about the conclusions I draw in the immediate aftermath. However, I have now been writing to you for 4 months, which is considerably more than 3 days, and I find that the conclusions I began to draw in April have not changed in the intervening time. They have, in fact, deepened. I am telling you this because I do not want to be in another situation where I am careful to the point of not saying the thing that most needs saying." He had read that paragraph in the late afternoon light of his mountain cabin, with the creek running outside and the wind coming down off the high country and the pine smell of it mixing with the paper smell of the letter. And he had sat for a long time after reading it doing what he did with important things, which was turn it over carefully and look at it from all the angles. And then he had written back, in the careful hand that the mountains had given him for all practical writing, and he had said what needed to be said, which was that he had been thinking about her since April as well, not because she was the subject of an adventure or a rescue, but because she was a person of unusual honesty and intelligence and courage, and because the hour they had spent at a breakfast table in Denver talking about teaching and traplines and the nature of useful work had been, in his estimation, the best conversation he had had with another human being in the better part of a decade, and that the months of letters had only confirmed what that hour had begun. He had also said, because he was a practical man who believed in doing things directly when they mattered, "I intend to come to Abilene in November, when the trapline work slows for the season, if you will receive me. I would like to continue this conversation in person, with a longer view toward what it might become." Her reply had taken 2 weeks to arrive, which was longer than her usual time, and he had spent those 2 weeks being, for the first time in recent memory, genuinely impatient with something. It was a short letter. It said, "Yes, come in November, I will receive you." The rest of the letter was about the new school building, which had opened on schedule in September, and about her first week back in the classroom, which she described with a joy so evident on the page that he found himself smiling at the paper in a way he was grateful no one was there to witness. He came down from the mountains in early November of 1879, when the first real snowfall had settled the high country into the white stillness of winter, and the marten and beaver had gone quiet under the ice. He took the train from Denver to Pueblo to Dodge City to Abilene, the long crossing of the plains that he had not made since he first went west nearly a decade ago, and the flatness of it was strange to him now. This man who had become a mountain man in every sense, and who found the absence of vertical relief disorienting in a way he had not anticipated. But Abilene was not flat in the ways that mattered. Clara and Samuel Hatch's house was on a wide street with cottonwood trees that had gone gold and were shedding in the November wind. And when Timothy came up the front walk on an afternoon in the second week of November with his saddlebags and his good coat and his 2 weeks of deliberate preparation, the door opened before he could knock, and Harriet Boone was standing in it. She looked different from how she had looked on the train platform in Denver. She was not the woman holding herself carefully erect in an intolerable situation, or the woman in the hotel parlor who was only beginning to lay down what she had been carrying. She was, Timothy thought, looking very specifically like herself, a woman in her element, in a place where she was known and valued, with color in her face from October air and a quality of settled energy that was entirely new and entirely right. "You came," she said, not with surprise exactly, but with the particular quality of a person who had believed something and is now receiving confirmation of that belief, which is distinct from surprise. "I said I would," he said. She stepped back and let him in. He met Clara, who was visibly and happily pregnant and who had Harriet's same quality of direct attention, though it was deployed differently, more sociably and with more readiness to smile. He met Samuel Hatch, who was a steady man of the plains, a grain merchant with a handshake like a gatepost and eyes that assessed Timothy fairly and without hostility. They had supper together that first evening, the four of them, and it was an easy meal in the way that a meal is easy when the people at the table are genuinely glad to be together. And afterward Timothy and Harriet walked in the yard under the cottonwoods, while the November wind sent the last of the leaves skittering along the dry ground. "How long will you stay?" she asked. "As long as is useful," he said. "I have no trapline to tend until January. The cabin will hold itself." She was quiet for a moment, and then, "What are you thinking about, Timothy?" He had spent 10 days on trains thinking about this question in advance of its being asked, and he gave it the answer he had prepared, which was also the honest one. "I am thinking about the fact that I have been alone in the mountains for 2 years and was, until 5 minutes into a conversation at a breakfast table in Denver, entirely comfortable with that arrangement," he said, "and that I am now not comfortable with it, and that I would like very much to know whether you would be willing to consider a different arrangement." She turned to look at him directly, and the last of the amber light from the house windows was on her face, and she looked at him with those direct, honest eyes that he had been thinking about since April and that had, in the intervening months of letters, become the eyes he most wanted to see when he thought about things he wanted to share. "Define the arrangement," she said, "specifically." He smiled, because she had always been exact when it mattered, and he loved this about her in the particular way that you love the specific things about a specific person rather than the general idea of them. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "with the full understanding that courting in my case happens to involve an eventual proposal, because I am not a man who does things halfway when I have decided to do them, and I have decided to do this." He paused. "I would also like to be honest with you that I live in the mountains, and that this is where I intend to continue living, but that the mountains are large and there are settlements in them, and I have been thinking about whether a man who lives in the mountains might build something larger than a trapper's cabin." She was looking at him with an expression that was doing several things at once, and the primary thing it was doing was being entirely sure of itself. "I have been offered my teaching position for the full year," she said. "They want me to stay through June. I gave my word." "June is a fine time to come to the mountains," he said. She looked at the cottonwood trees for a moment, and at the Kansas sky above them, which was cold and clear and full of the particular depth that the plains sky has at night. "All right," she said. Then she turned back to him with the full-on smile that he had been thinking about since the Denver train platform, the spectacular, genuine one. "Court me properly, Timothy Townsend. Let's see how you manage it." He courted her properly. He stayed in Abilene through December, taking a room at the local hotel, and spending his days helping Samuel Hatch with the grain storage work that kept the winter busy, and his evenings at the Hatch house in conversation with Harriet that ranged from practical to philosophical to the gently personal. And he found, through each of these conversations, more of the same thing he had been finding since the breakfast table in Denver. A person who thought carefully and honestly, and who challenged his own thinking in ways that made it better, and who had a capacity for joy that her ordeal had not destroyed, only temporarily suppressed, and that was now reasserting itself with a vigor that was beautiful to witness. He kissed her for the first time on a cold evening in the second week of December, in the Hatch kitchen while Clara was resting and Samuel was at the grain office, and it was not an impulsive kiss but a considered one, which nevertheless arrived with a warmth and a clarity that surprised them both, and after which Harriet looked at him with a slightly raised eyebrow that communicated both assessment and approval in equal measure. "You took your time," she said. "I like to be certain," he said. "Are you certain?" she asked. "Entirely," he said. "Have been since April." She laughed at that, a full and unguarded laugh, and he thought it was the best sound he had heard in the better part of his adult life. Clara Hatch delivered a healthy boy in early January, which filled the house with the particular cheerful chaos of a new infant, and gave Timothy occasion to observe Harriet in the role of doting aunt, which she occupied with a competence and a warmth that told him things about her character that letters and conversation could not quite reach. She was good with the baby in the practical, unsentimental way that people who genuinely like children are good with them, not performing nurture but actually providing it. And when she handed the boy back to Clara after an extended period of rocking and looked up to find Timothy watching her from the doorway, she simply met his eyes without self-consciousness, and he nodded once slowly, and she understood what the nod meant. He proposed to her on a Sunday afternoon in February, on the day she had returned from her school building after closing out the last of the fall semester's records, and she was sitting at the desk in her room with the sunlight coming through the window and a cup of cooling coffee, and the composition book stacked neatly beside her. And he knocked on the door and came in and said what he had to say directly and without ceremony, in the way she had told him she preferred things said. He told her that he loved her with the specific kind of love that attached itself to specific things. Her directness, her honesty, her capacity for courage under conditions that would have diminished lesser people, her kitchen garden, her handwriting, the way she looked when she talked about teaching, the way she had taken his hand on the train platform in Denver as a complete statement in itself. He told her that he wanted to spend his life with her, and that he had been thinking about the life he could build that would be worth offering her, and that he believed he could build one that was real and good, and in which she would not be constrained but would be, he hoped, expanded. He asked her to marry him. She set down her composition book and looked at him with the full weight of her attention, and then she stood up from the desk and crossed the room and stood in front of him, and she said, "Yes, I have been waiting for you to ask me since December." He pulled her close and held her, and she pressed her forehead briefly against his shoulder in a gesture that was so uncomplicated and genuine that he stood very still in case moving would somehow diminish it. "You could have told me to ask sooner," he said into her hair. "I could have," she agreed, "but I wanted you to be certain." "Were you not certain I was certain?" "I was," she said. "But I wanted you to be the one to say it." He laughed at that, a warm sound that he was not entirely accustomed to making, and she laughed against his shoulder, and the afternoon light lay across the room, and the Kansas plains lay outside the window, and everything was, for a long moment, entirely right. They were married in April of 1880, in the small Methodist church on the main street of Abilene, on a Saturday when the spring had finally made up its mind, and the cottonwood trees were beginning to bud in the warm insistence of the season. Clara Hatch, with her baby boy James on her hip, cried at the ceremony with the unabashed emotion of a woman who had spent 14 months terrified for her sister, and who was now watching that sister stand at the front of a church beside a mountain man with a broad, sun-darkened face and steady, honest eyes, and say her vows in a clear and certain voice. Samuel Hatch stood beside Timothy as witness, and shook his hand afterward with the same gate-post firmness, and a smile that was simple and genuine, and said everything that needed to be said. Harriet finished her teaching commitment through June, as she had promised, and Timothy came back to Abilene for the last weeks of the school year, and used the time to begin the work of preparation for the life they had discussed, which was, specifically, the life of a working settlement in the Colorado mountains. He had spent the winter months, when he was not in Abilene, researching the land claims available in the valley above Miller's Creek, and had identified a section of 40 acres on the east-facing slope above the creek, with access to water and good timber and south-facing exposure that would make a proper winter kitchen garden possible. He had filed a homestead claim in February and begun cutting timber for the main structure in March, working through the cold with the methodical patience of a man who knows how long things actually take and does not resent the time. By the time Harriet arrived at the mountain property in late July of 1880, the main cabin was framed and roofed, the chimney was functional, and the kitchen garden beds were laid out with flat river stones along the edges of the south wall, staked and ready for the fall planting. She stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at it in the long mountain afternoon light, and Timothy stood beside her and watched her look. "You built the garden first," she said. "I built the chimney first," he said. "The garden second." "The chimney and the garden," she said. "The two most important things," he said. She turned to him with the full smile, the spectacular one, and took his hand, and they stood in the late July light with the creek running below them and the mountains rising above and everything ahead of them still to build. They built it. The cabin grew through the fall and winter of 1880 and into 1881. New rooms added with the systematic patience that Timothy brought to everything, and the practical aesthetic that Harriet contributed in the form of careful thought about what each space needed to do. She taught at the newly organized school in the nearest valley settlement, 4 miles down from their property on a trail that was good in summer and passable in winter on horseback, and she threw herself into it with the full force of the joy that she had described in her September letter, the joy of doing work that she was made for and that mattered. Timothy continued his trapline work in the winters and expanded it into a trading operation that brought furs and mountain goods down to Denver twice a year, a business that was modest but solid and that grew steadily as the Colorado mountain settlements grew, and the demand for well-caught furs in Denver's increasingly prosperous markets increased. He was good at it and he was honest about it, and he had the particular business advantage of being known as a man who never misrepresented the quality of what he sold. He was also, he discovered, good at building things, which was not a surprise in retrospect. He had built a life in the mountains from raw conditions, which required a very thorough understanding of structure and load-bearing capacity in the non-architectural sense. The cabin became a house properly, with a second story added in the spring of 1882, and with the second story came the room that Harriet had spent considerable thought on, and that she informed Timothy one morning over coffee, with the direct and unhurried manner that he had loved since the first time she had said something important at a breakfast table, would be needed. Their first child, a boy, was born in October of 1882. They named him James for Harriet's nephew. It was a name that pleased both of them for the way it sounded against the mountain air, solid and real, a name a person could live up to. He had his father's broad frame, within the compressed proportions of an infant, and his mother's dark eyes, and he was by general consensus a remarkable baby, though Timothy was aware that this was not an objective assessment. Harriet wrote to Clara about the birth the same evening, by the lamplight of the new upstairs room, while Timothy sat beside the bed and held James with the careful, slightly stunned attention of a man who has just become a father and is recalibrating his understanding of the relevant scales. "You are going to be very good at this," Harriet told him, watching him with the baby. "I have no idea what I am doing," he said. "That will pass," she said. "You are attentive and patient, and you do not panic in difficult situations. These are the primary requirements." He looked at her with a warmth that he no longer had to work to contain or manage. "You should know that you are the most competent person I have ever met," he said, "at everything you turn your attention to." She reached over and adjusted James's blanket in the angle of Timothy's arm with the small, efficient sureness of a woman who has already learned more than most people learn in a month about the requirements of a new baby, and then she took Timothy's hand with her other hand and held it. "We are doing all right," she said. "We are doing exceptionally," he said. Gerald Cass died in the winter of 1881, of a heart failure that a Redemption newspaper notice described as sudden and peaceful, which Timothy read about in the Denver paper 3 months after the fact and showed to Harriet without comment. She read it twice and set the paper down and was quiet for a moment. "I am not glad of a man's death," she said carefully, "but I am glad of what it means." "Yes," Timothy said. She looked at the paper for another moment. "The two women," she said. "The ones before me, I still think about them sometimes." "So do I," he said. They did not speak further about it, because there was nothing to be resolved there, only acknowledged, and they had learned the difference between things that needed resolution and things that needed only acknowledgement. The injustice of what had happened to those women, and likely to others in arrangements like Cass's throughout the territories, was a real weight that did not disappear simply because Cass had. But it was a weight that existed in the world, and had to be carried with honesty rather than resolved into false comfort. The spring of 1883 brought new neighbors to the valley, a family named Whitmore, the same family that had been contesting Cass's attempts at their mining claim, who had held out through the years of pressure and were now, with Cass gone, expanding their operation and bringing a younger son and his wife to settle the adjacent valley section. The younger son was named Aaron Whitmore, and his wife was named Ellie, and they became, over the course of that first summer, the kind of neighbors that the mountain country made when it made them well people who understood that distance was both real and navigable, and that the work of being a neighbor at elevation was not casual but deliberate. Harriet and Ellie Whitmore became friends with the depth that friendship achieves when two women of intelligence and capability find each other in a landscape that requires both. And that friendship was its own significant thing in Harriet's life, filling a space that letters to Clara could occupy in part, but not entirely. Clara and Samuel came to visit in the summer of 1883, making the journey by train to Denver and from there on horseback with a guide that Timothy arranged. And James Hatch, now a toddler of 18 months, met his namesake James Townsend in the kitchen garden, while the four adults sat on the cabin porch in the evening and watched the mountains change color in the last light. And Clara cried again, quietly, just once, with no particular embarrassment about it. "You have made something real here," Clara said. "We have," Harriet said, and leaned against Timothy's shoulder in the way she had of doing that, not dramatically but completely, the full weight of her trust and her ease expressed in the simple fact of the lean. Timothy Townsend, who had once lived alone in the mountains without any particular regret about it, put his arm around his wife on the porch of the house they had built together, and looked at the white peaks above the valley, and felt a fullness of life that he had not known he was lacking until it arrived, and that he understood now as the thing the mountains had been holding in trust for him until he was ready to receive it. The second child, another boy, came in the summer of 1885. They named him Samuel for the gatepost handshake man who had given them a good seat at a supper table and asked no difficult questions. Samuel Townsend had his mother's dark hair and his father's quietness, and he was, from the earliest age, deeply interested in the natural world in the specific way of a child born into a landscape that rewards observation, which was a quality that both his parents recognized and cultivated deliberately. James, the older, was by contrast a talker, clear-voiced and specific the way his mother was specific, and had already demonstrated at 4 years old the capacity to organize a room of people younger and older than himself around whatever project he had decided was the current priority, which was a quality that his parents regarded with mingled amusement and recognition. The school in the Valley settlement grew as the settlements grew, and Harriet's role in it expanded accordingly. From a one-room operation she had found with 3 grades mixed together to a 2-room school by 1886, with a second teacher for the lower grades whom Harriet helped hire and train with the same methodical investment she brought to her kitchen garden building for the long season, thinking ahead. Timothy built a smokehouse in 1886 and added a proper stable in the spring of 1887. And the property on the east slope above Miller's Creek had become, by any honest measure, a working homestead of the kind that the Homestead Act had imagined, and that reality far more rarely produced than the legislation had hoped. One evening in October of 1887, which was a sharp-haired evening with the first hard frost on the pumpkins in the kitchen garden, and the smell of wood smoke coming down off the high country. Timothy and Harriet were sitting at the table after supper with the boys asleep upstairs, and the lamp low between them. And Harriet was writing a letter to a cousin in Illinois who had written asking about the realities of Western life for an educated woman with ambitions. And Timothy was reading a report about the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad's new line extension that had implications for his trading route. He set down the report and looked at her. She looked up from her letter. "What?" she said, knowing him well enough to know that the look had content. "Nothing specific," he said. "I was thinking about Miller's Creek." She tilted her head. She always tilted her head slightly when she was listening in the full way. "I was thinking about the afternoon in May of 1879 when I nearly rode past a bottle caught on a root," he said, "and about all the things that happened afterward from a very small alteration in the angle of the sun." She looked at him for a long moment with the amber-dark eyes that still had, after 8 years and 2 children, and a full and complicated life, the quality of being the most honest and direct and specifically themselves eyes he had ever known. "I think about that sometimes too," she said. "About the bottle, about the current being slow that spring and the root catching it where it did." She paused. "I tried not to hope. When I put it in the water, I told myself not to hope because hoping from that particular situation was a dangerous thing to do." "But you hoped," he said. "I hoped," she said, carefully, with both hands. He reached across the table and took her hand, the way she had taken his on the train platform in Denver, firmly and with intention and without any doubt about the meaning of it. "I am glad you hoped," he said. She turned her hand under his and held it back with the same firmness and the same intention. And the lamp was warm between them and the frost was on the pumpkins outside, and the boys were asleep upstairs, and the mountains were present in the dark outside the window. And Harriet Boone Townsend looked at the man who had found her letter in the water and ridden toward what he did not yet know was the best thing he would ever do. And she gave him the full smile, the spectacular one. The one that reached every part of her face and had nothing in it that was performance or armor or careful management. Only the real and complete and deeply particular truth of a woman who is precisely where she chose to be. "So am I," she said, "every single day." He brought her hand up and kissed her knuckles in the way he had of doing that simply and without ceremony, with only the full weight of meaning behind the simplicity. Outside, the creek ran along the base of the east slope as it always did, carrying water from the high country down through the valley in the steady, unhurried manner of mountain water that has a long way to go and has learned, over geological time, the particular virtue of patience. It ran past the place where a bottle had caught on a root on a May afternoon 8 years ago, and it ran on north toward the valley and south toward the plains, as indifferent to human significance as water always is, and as essential. And in the cabin on the east slope, with the kitchen garden along the south wall, and the smoke house, and the stable, and the 2 boys asleep in the upstairs room, 2 people sat at a table in the lamplight holding hands across a letter and a report, entirely at home in the life they had made, with the mountains outside the window and the future, open and full and entirely their own, stretching ahead in all the directions that matter.